Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. JeffreySachs Fan World, and here is today's content. When I first learned that former President Donald Trump had chosen not to invite South Africa to next year's G20 summit, I immediately recognized that the decision carried far more weight than a simple adjustment to a guest list. In global diplomacy, exclusion is never merely procedural. It is symbolic, strategic, and intentionally communicative. And in this case, it reveals the unsettling trajectory of global politics, the transformation of multilateral spaces into arenas of punishment and alignment. From my perspective, Trump's move is not an isolated decision. It is a message in platforms where nations of vastly different political systems can discuss economic coordination, climate policies, financial stability, and global development. To exclude a country like South Africa, Africa's most industrialized economy, a vital diplomatic actor, and a founding BRICS member, is to signal a recalibration of geopolitical expectations. It says, in effect, your political choices have consequences. Yet this raises a fundamental question. What choices exactly? South Africa has pursued an increasingly independent foreign policy over the past decade. It has been vocal on issues where Washington and Brussels prefer silence, most recently on Gaza, where Pretoria took the unprecedented step of filing a genocide case at the International Court of Justice. It has also maintained warm and unapologetic ties with Russia, hosting joint naval exercises and refusing to align with Western sanctions. And crucially, South Africa is a core member of BRICS, a bloc increasingly perceived in Washington as an alternative center of gravity in the global economy. To Trump and to many in his political circle, these actions are not signs of balanced diplomacy. They are signs of defiance. Excluding South Africa from the G20 therefore becomes a strategic demonstration of displeasure. It is a subtle form of coercion, a reminder that the U.S. still holds levers of international recognition and that participation in global governance structures is not guaranteed. But this approach also exposes a deeper flaw in contemporary Western diplomacy, the belief that exclusion can reshape geopolitical behavior. From my vantage point, exclusion has the opposite effect. Instead of incentivizing alignment, it strengthens alternative blocs, accelerates polarization, and pushes middle powers like South Africa further into the arms of actors China, Russia, and the BRICS collective, who offer partnership without political conditions. Trump's decision thus carries two layers of symbolism. For South Africa, it is a warning. For the world, it is a troubling sign of how global forums, once built to encourage dialogue, are now weaponized to enforce loyalty. In this sense, the G20 exclusion is not simply a story about South Africa. It is a story about a global order losing its capacity to accommodate difference. And that, I believe, is more dangerous than any political disagreement between Washington and Pretoria. Its strategy is not based on surpassing the United States model for model or chip for chip, but on mobilizing a vast ecosystem of developers who can experiment without permission, iterate without constraint, and deploy without corporate gatekeeping. This is the essence of China's open source momentum. An open source model, unlike a tightly controlled proprietary system, allows individuals and startups to download, dissect, adjust, and integrate advanced capabilities into their own products. What may take a billion-dollar institution months or years to refine can be adapted by a small team in days. The velocity of innovation increases exponentially, not because one firm is dominant, but because tens of thousands of minds are contributing simultaneously. This is where China holds a structural advantage. Its population of AI engineers, university researchers, and self-taught developers is enormous, and they operate in a technological ecosystem that encourages remixing and rapid iteration. Chinese tech culture thrives on fast adaptation. Tools are absorbed, modified, and redeployed at astonishing speed. Open source AI fits naturally into this environment, acting as a catalyst for innovation at every layer, from consumer apps to industrial automation. By contrast, much of the U.S. innovation environment has become bound to a corporate model that prioritizes proprietary ownership. The leading American AI companies, OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, release exceptional research, but their most powerful models remain locked behind API walls or subscription plans. Their incentives are shaped by shareholder expectations, contractual arrangements, and regulatory constraints. While this model produces world-class technology, it also slows the diffusion of knowledge, limiting smaller players' ability to build on the frontier. China, in sharp contrast, views openness itself as a strategic asset. The government has actively supported the development and release of open-source AI frameworks, recognizing that widespread access strengthens national capacity. Provinces, universities, and private firms participate in this ecosystem, not as isolated actors, but as interconnected contributors. The effect is a kind of technological multiplier. Each new model released publicly becomes the foundation for dozens, if not hundreds, of derivative innovations. The rise of DeepSeek underscores this dynamic. The company has gained global attention for producing models that compete with top-tier U.S. systems at a fraction of the cost. DeepSeek represents the logical outcome of China's open-source philosophy, a firm capable of pairing technical sophistication with cost efficiency, making advanced AI accessible far beyond wealthy corporations or institutions. Its emergence demonstrates that China's strength lies not merely in state support, but in the distributed creativity of its developer community. Seen in this light, China's forward momentum is not a consequence of copying American systems or benefiting from Western openness. It is a consequence of embracing a different development model altogether. Instead of protecting a few corporate champions, China is empowering an entire technological culture space that Western structures increasingly fail to provide. In this sense, South Africa's G20 exclusion is not merely a bilateral issue. It reflects the broader crisis of a world order struggling to adapt to plurality. The U.S. expects alignment. South Africa expects autonomy. And in between those expectations lies the real geopolitical tension, not only between two nations, but between two visions of how global power should function in the 21st century. As I examine the growing distance between South Africa and the Western powers, I am struck by how rapidly disappointment has hardened into strategic punishment. What began as quiet irritation in Washington and Brussels has evolved into open diplomatic signaling, and Trump's decision to exclude South Africa from the upcoming G20 is perhaps the clearest manifestation of this shift. It reveals a deeper truth. Western governments increasingly expect political alignment from partners, and when that alignment is absent, they resort to coercive forms of diplomacy. Let me start with the source of Western frustration. In the eyes of the United States and Europe, South Africa has deviated from what they consider the responsible position on several major geopolitical crises. Pretoria's non-alignment on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for example, has baffled Western policymakers who assumed that the moral framing of the war would automatically compel support. Yet South Africa, drawing on its history of anti-colonial struggle, refused to be pressured into condemning Moscow in the one-sided terms expected by the West. It emphasized dialogue, de-escalation, and the need for a negotiated settlement. To Washington and many European capitals, this was not nuance, it was betrayal. The frustration deepened as South Africa embraced causes that the West either dismissed or actively opposed. The most notable was Pretoria's decision to bring a genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. For the West, this crossed an unspoken line. When I evaluate the economic consequences of Trump's decision to exclude South Africa from the G20, I see a far more complex picture than the headline suggests. The exclusion is not merely symbolic. It risks triggering a slow, corrosive form of economic decoupling between the United States and South Africa. And in a global economy already fractured by sanctions, protectionism, and competing financial blocs, even small diplomatic signals can have outsized effects on trade flows, investment decisions, and long-term development trajectories. Let me begin with South Africa. Its economy is fragile, plagued by chronic power shortages, high unemployment, declining industrial output, and weakened investor confidence. Being excluded from the G20 directly undermines Pretoria's diplomatic legitimacy at a moment when it desperately needs multilateral engagement. For investors, exclusion reinforces the perception that South Africa is drifting into the geopolitical orbit of BRICS and away from Western markets. That perception alone can shift investment portfolios. Firms prioritize stability, predictability, and geopolitical alignment, and Trump's signal suggests that South Africa may be entering a category of politically risky nations in the eyes of Western capital. This matters profoundly. South Africa depends on Western markets for exports, especially in automotive manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. Instead of isolating South Africa, it may isolate the United States from a rapidly changing world where countries refuse to accept the old hierarchies. Trump's exclusionary act is thus more than a diplomatic insult. It is a turning point, one that forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that Western influence is no longer guaranteed and that coercion is a poor substitute for genuine partnership. When I evaluate the economic consequences of Trump's decision to exclude South Africa from the G20, I see a far more complex picture than the headline suggests. The exclusion is not merely symbolic. It risks triggering a slow, corrosive form of economic decoupling between the United States and South Africa. And in a global economy already fractured by sanctions, protectionism, and competing financial blocs, even small diplomatic signals can have outsized effects on trade flows, investment decisions, and long-term development trajectories. Let me begin with South Africa. Its economy is fragile, plagued by chronic power shortages, high unemployment, declining industrial output, and weakened investor confidence. Being excluded from the G20 directly undermines Pretoria's diplomatic legitimacy at a moment when it desperately needs multilateral engagement. For investors, exclusion reinforces the perception that South Africa is drifting into the geopolitical orbit of BRICS and away from Western markets. That perception alone can shift investment portfolios. Firms prioritize stability, predictability, and geopolitical alignment. And Trump's signal suggests that South Africa may be entering a category of politically risky nations in the eyes of Western capital. This matters profoundly. South Africa depends on Western markets for exports, especially in automotive manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. It also relies on Western institutional finance, World Bank loans, IMF negotiations, and commercial creditors to manage its debt burden. If exclusion hardens into a perception of unreliability, credit ratings could suffer, borrowing costs could rise, and foreign direct investment could decline. In essence, South Africa may pay an economic price for asserting political independence, but the consequences do not end there. There is also a reverse effect the United States stands to lose as well. Washington frequently forgets that South Africa is not a marginal economy. It is the industrial anchor of sub-Saharan Africa, a gateway to continental markets, and a key player in mineral supply chains critical for the green transition. Platinum, palladium, manganese, rare earths, many of these materials are produced at scale only in South Africa. Alienating Pretoria risks pushing these strategic resources deeper into the supply networks of China and BRICS partners. This would be a strategic miscalculation. The U.S. is already competing with China for global mineral access. By isolating South Africa, America undermines its own supply chain security and weakens its influence in Africa's largest diplomatic institutions, including the African Union. It also risks creating an economic vacuum that China will eagerly fill with infrastructure investments, currency swap agreements, and development loans. There is another layer to consider: the South African middle class. They benefit from trade with Europe and the U.S. Exclusion signals uncertainty, and uncertainty dampens consumer confidence, private investment, and job creation. Economic stagnation, in turn, fuels political instability, something that neither South Africa nor the broader region can afford. In truth, economic decoupling rarely punishes only one side. It reshapes alliances, redirects trade routes, and accelerates fragmentation in the global economy. Trump's move may appear punitive, but it risks weakening the very Western influence that the U.S. seeks to preserve. Thus, the exclusion is not just a diplomatic maneuver, it is an economic gamble. And in an already polarized global economy, such gambles tend to produce long-term consequences far beyond what any single political decision maker intends. As I reflect on Trump's exclusion of South Africa from the upcoming G20 summit, I am drawn to a broader and more troubling realization. The global order is drifting toward fragmentation because the very institutions designed to promote cooperation are now being weaponized for geopolitical signaling. In this sense, the decision is not only about South Africa, it is about the future of multilateralism itself, its fragility, its politicization, and its uncertain place in an increasingly divided world. Let me begin with what the G20 was intended to be. It was never a club of ideological similarity, nor a reward for political alignment. It was built in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis as a recognition that global challenges from banking crises to climate change cannot be resolved by the West alone. It was an acknowledgement of the growing importance of emerging economies, including South Africa. The forum succeeded precisely because it embraced diversity. It offered space for countries that disagreed, competed, or even distrusted one another to sit at the same table and address shared vulnerabilities. Trump's decision undermines that spirit. It transforms the G20 from a platform of dialogue into a tool of exclusion, conditioning participation on geopolitical conformity. This shift is dangerous. When multilateral institutions become instruments of political punishment, they lose legitimacy. They lose effectiveness, and ultimately, they lose their purpose. A G20 without South Africa is not a stronger G20. It is a narrower, more polarized, less representative reflection of global power. South Africa, for its part, faces a complex dilemma. On one hand, it seeks autonomy in its foreign policy rooted in anti-apartheid history and non-alignment principles. On the other, it remains deeply economically intertwined with Western markets. If exclusion becomes a pattern rather than an episode, Pretoria risks being pulled further into the geopolitical gravitational field of BRICS. That shift is not inherently problematic, but the forced nature of it, driven by Western punishment rather than domestic strategy, threatens South Africa's ability to act as a bridge between worlds. In a multipolar era, countries like South Africa should not be forced to choose sides. They should help connect them. For the United States, the G20 exclusion reflects a short-sighted approach. By penalizing South Africa, Washington weakens its long-term influence in Africa and risks alienating one of the continent's most important diplomatic players. It also fuels the narrative prevalent across the global South that Western powers seek obedience, not partnership. This narrative is corrosive, and it is increasingly difficult to counter when actions like these reinforce it. There is a philosophical lesson underneath all of this. Global governance cannot function if diversity is treated as defiance and independence as insubordination. The world is moving toward pluralism, not unipolarity. Middle powers are asserting agency. Regional blocs are rising. New economic institutions are emerging. Exclusion may satisfy short-term political instincts, but it accelerates long-term fragmentation. As I see it, South Africa's exclusion is not just a diplomatic dispute, it is a symptom of a deeper crisis in Western engagement with the global South, a crisis driven by an inability to accept that influence in the 21st century must be earned, not imposed, shared, not dictated. If the global community hopes to rebuild a cooperative order, it must resist the temptation to turn every disagreement into a test of loyalty. For multilateralism to survive, it must remain inclusive, especially of those who challenge prevailing narratives. Otherwise, we risk constructing a world of isolated blocs, mistrust, and diminishing spaces for dialogue. And in such a world, no nation, neither the United States nor South Africa, will find true stability.